everyone. I am Kelly Skinner, and I am the founder and owner of Soul Care Urban Retreat Center in Urbana, Illinois. And this is the first in a series of video podcasts that I will be hosting to just provide some resources and information and insight with people who have great things to offer in the realm of spiritual wellness and self-care. And I'm joined today for our very first one with one of our soul care partners, Melanie Sheckels. And her and I are just going to be having a conversation around what she does and her thoughts about some of the things that are going on in these just weird times that we're in. When we're all mostly sheltered in place in our homes and not going out unless it's essential, and dealing with a lot of change and uncertainty. And so I'm really excited to spend some time having a conversation with Melanie about some of these ideas that we've been having and just important information and insight to share. So welcome, Melanie, and tell people a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining in. I am the founder and sole doula at Threshold End of Life Doula Services. So a doula is essentially a guide. It's someone who walks beside someone as they're going through something very difficult. I chose the name Threshold because I take care of people at the end of life and through grief. So these are experiences that are like crossing a threshold, because once you have entered this new phase of your life, there's no going back to who you were before. So in my role as a doula, I help people to have critical conversations about dying and grief in order to help them create the most regret-free and peaceful end-of-life experience possible. One of the things that I'm really most passionate about, though, is community outreach and education. And this is so helpful when it comes to death and dying and grief, because these are things that are very uncomfortable, and so we don't really like to think about them or talk about them. And so to do that, I've created an event with another local doula in town, Melissa Morgan. It's called Waking Death, and we started that back in the fall. It's modeled after the Death Cafe model. If you're not familiar with that, it's essentially a community space where all are welcome to come and have open conversations about death and dying without any agenda, really, just a curiosity about what it means that we are all impermanent, that we have life and at some point it will end. So that has been such a fantastic experience. I've really enjoyed group facilitation and just, really beautiful, connected, interesting conversations that happen within our community.
Yeah, when we were doing that at Soul Care, we were doing that the first Wednesday of every month, and it was an in-person experience. And we were getting 20, 25 people as part of those conversations, and they were really amazing. The openness that people had and their willingness to share their personal experiences, their willingness to ask questions of one another, and just make that connection with really a group of strangers. And there's a core group that comes every month, or was coming every month, and then every month we would have new participants One month we even had some students from the death and dying class uh, at the University of Illinois, and they were amazing. So I'm really glad that we have decided to shift that and continue offering that as a partnership with Soul Care and the two doulas in the Champaign area, and just bring those conversations online. So I'm actually there. There was one of them that was held 2 weeks ago,
Yes.
beginning of April.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into that a little bit more about what that's going to look like moving forward. Um, but why, we've had lots of conversations over the last weeks, and I think both of us are in agreement that this is a time for a time where people are experiencing grief and grieving, not just of uh, death itself, but death of a physical body, but many little deaths. And so, talk a little bit about what grief work is. People may not be familiar with that term, and why that's really relevant right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first, I would say that a lot of us are accustomed to thinking of grief as something that happens to a person when someone they love has died. And that is absolutely valid. Um, but it can really manifest around any loss. Um, if you've lost your job, your sense of purpose, if you've lost your, financial security, if you've lost some sort of milestone that, was you were really looking forward to, like a graduation type event, um, or just you've lost your primary ways of connecting with people. It can be many different things. And it manifests not just as a sort of sadness or depression, but it has a very physical component as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some people experience, loss of appetite, loss of sleep, this just like underlying restlessness, headaches, stomach aches, intrusive thoughts, so many different ways. And so grief work is not simply, counseling where you would sit down with a therapist and tell them what you're feeling and engage in some sort of like cognitive behavioral retraining or learning how to think about things differently. Grief work is really the process of learning to make sense of a world in which something that would matter to you so much no longer exists.
Mm.
And the way that we approach that is unique for every single person who's experiencing it. And many of you maybe have heard before, like, grief is so personal, it's so individual. There's no wrong way to do it. What's normal is what's normal for you.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, there are certain components that continue to resurface as really helpful tools for processing grief. As I said, there is a physical component, and so there is movement and breathwork practices that can be really helpful tools,
Mm-hmm.
as well as storytelling and really naming it was that mattered so much, um, that it's basically unfathomable for you to go on in this life without this or resource or what have you that mattered so much. So that's in a nutshell my approach to grief work.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like I've heard people almost minimizing or comparing their grief. So almost discounting, if I'm feeling grief over the fact that my son who's graduating from college won't be able to have his physical graduation, you might be tempted to compare that to somebody's grief at losing their job, or um, not being able to see a loved one. And I've heard people trying to minimize their own grief or compare their lived experience with somebody else's lived experience. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a thing that I hear pretty frequently is people kind of will have a tendency to dismiss their own loss because, oh, other people have it so much worse than I do.
Mhm.
I have no right to complain. And, you know, grieving is pretty distinct from complaining. Naming something that mattered and is now not available to you is totally valid and important. And I think I approach this from a sense that all of our needs are are all worthy of being met,
Mhm.
of love, um, and we don't have to approach it from a standpoint of scarcity. There is around. When we do start to compare our grief, we disrupt our ability to connect. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Connect how? Connect with
Um,
one another or connect with ourselves?
well, probably both. I was speaking to connection with another. So
Hmm.
if I were to say, the loss of experiencing my son's graduation, um, if I were to weigh it out against your experience of loss of your job or loss of someone's life, we are now in a place where we're not just actually seeing each other's experiences, and we're not able to um, really I'm sorry.
I almost hear you say that you're not able to connect with somebody else and validate somebody else's experience if you can't validate your own experience.
uh, yes, I think that's absolutely true. Yes. You can't fully have empathy for another if you're not allowing that empathy in for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
um, there is immeasurable loss and suffering and sorrow in this world, and you withholding love from the and compassion from the places where you've experienced loss does not create more love for other people in the world who are experiencing loss.
Mm-hmm.
And by withholding that love, I believe that you were actually kind of rendering yourself powerless to be able to give compassionate presence to other people who are experiencing losses that are also important and valid.
Mm-hmm. That makes total sense. Yeah. Um, and that's actually a really good segue because we talked a little bit about people being grief averse, so not just minimizing your own grief or kind of comparing your grief to others, but not wanting to experience grief at all, and to shut that behind a wall and deny that you're even in grief, or deny the emotions or experiences around grief, and kind of put that aside and gloss it over. Talk about that a little bit, and what does that mean for people if they're acting in a grief averse way?
So I would say that kind of in general in our culture, we want to avoid things that are uncomfortable. Um, we want to avoid pain. We want to avoid intense emotions. We want to avoid them from personally from ourselves, but we also want to protect those around us when we experience those things. We hide our pain. Um, and when we don't talk about it openly, it kind of creates an environment where everyone is kind of walking on eggshells. We don't really know how to support one another. Um, I've noticed a lot of people just kind of like trying to crowdsource professionals who can help their loved one deal with their loss. And, I absolutely think people should get whatever support is meaningful to them. I also think that there is possibility in creating a culture around community grief support, where this is not a thing that we need to necessarily outsource. Grief is a natural part of life. A fundamental part of life is that everything we love will die or change.
Mm-hmm.
Around us is permanent. And so, since that is a fundamental fact of life, how can we normalize this in a way that we are supporting those losses on the daily?
Mm-hmm.
How can we meet each other with a sense of love and belonging, whether we're in the throes of loss or in the throes of love, and recognize that when you're in one, the other is asleep. The other is waiting for you in the other room, and you will be in the other.
Mhm. Yeah. And it's not, so again, what I hear you saying is that we don't fix grief. We don't just fix it and forget it. We
Mm-mm.
learn how to identify it. We learn how to fully feel it and experience it. And then, I guess, from a spiritual or religious perspective, uh, grief and hope, grief and love are two sides of the same coin. And
Mm.
so at some point in time, we're going to experience grief. And then at some points in time, we're going to be experiencing hope and love. And you can't have one without the other. And so if you fix and forget your grief, you're not going to fully experience hope and love. And it's an ongoing cycle.
It is. It is.
Mhm.
Um,
Wow.
my life, I've tried to build in ritual or practices where I am actively connecting with, the memory of my ancestors who have mattered so much to me. I took on my own apprenticeship with grief work in September of 2017 when my mom passed away. And that was not my first experience of loss of a beloved person, let alone loss in general. And what has become um, exceedingly, what I've been made aware of as time goes on is that, grief will manifest in my body if I don't honor how much that relationship mattered.
Mhm.
And so I think about how that relationship mattered, and I find ways to incorporate that into my life in a really beautiful and special way. And so I'm not always experiencing that particular grief in a painful way. though sometimes I am. I cried the other day that I missed my mom.
Mhm.
But yeah.
Mhm. And I'm reminded that uh, so many transformative stories begin with a loss. And
Mm.
so maybe we can't move into who we're supposed to be. We can't transform into whatever the new normal is if we don't lose some things that were part of the old normal.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard people say, I didn't realize that I had taken different relationships for granted, or I had taken for granted the ability to, go to the grocery store, or these other things. And some when things are routine, I mean, you can't sense the weight of a loss until you can sense the full weight of its absence.
Mhm.
So a loss of this kind, there is so much possibility to learn about what really matters to us in
Mhm.
this time. And I don't want to um, downplay the part of just that means feeling pain. That
Yeah.
we have to feel our feelings.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It's not all fun and games.
Mm-mm.
It's called loss for a reason.
Yeah.
Um, so we've talked about grief in context of not just yourself, but how important others and connecting with others is. And so, how do we deal with grief in community? How do we deal with grief in context of other people?
Yeah. So I really do think that community is an integral part of good grief care. Um, the thing about grief aversion is I have this feeling that it actually is part of the pain that we associate with our grief, I think is actually related to grief aversion.
Mhm.
And that if we were surrounded by a village that inherently believed in our worthiness of love and belonging, and picked up our hands and held us close when we were in the throes of loss, that we would grieve better and more fully, and we wouldn't experience loss as painfully. Um, I think that part of what makes grief so hard and so unbearable is the fact that we can't share it, and that the thing that mattered so much to us has essentially disappeared for the rest of the world. And so we're so isolated in that loss.
Mhm.
So community really has an opportunity to recognize that we all, as living beings, we all will experience loss, and just show up for each other with love and acceptance.
Mhm.
Um, an integral part of that, though, is learning not to move towards or away from our discomfort. Because when we see someone in pain, and being in a culture where we believe we're not supposed to be experiencing hard things, we want to fix or avoid that pain.
Mhm.
What
Yeah.
I'm suggesting is we embrace that pain. We recognize that that is a rite of passage for every human. and we say, yes, I see you. I know that. I've been in that pain. Your loss is my loss.
Mhm.
There with you.
Yeah. Um, so I'm sure that we've been seeing on Facebook and in memes about feeling your feelings and being okay and doing these things. And I think what you just said is a very tangible way that we can actually practice that and not just have it be a feel good phrase, but how we can live into that and something tangible that we can actually do.
Mm.
Um, so you talked about the village or a village concept, and I know you've been actually working on a project around that metaphor and that model about how you can support people in learning how to express and share and support one another through grief. So, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I had been dreaming and plotting about how I wanted to, um, how I want grief work to show up in our community and how I want us to show up for each other and how my toolkit can be shared with other people. And so I really, when this all happened, I recognized less prep, more presence. It's time to just do this. And so I decided that what's really fundamental about grief care right now is just that we all show up for each other. We learn how to hold space
Mm.
and just have a free space for community members to come, share their story of loss, and be witnessed with love. Very simple.
So I've heard that term before, holding space. What does that mean?
Well, it's I think that to do it well involves many different elements. I think for me, the way that I think about it is how do we foster um, trust and presence? So I think that there are some important ground rules, such as anonymity. What happens in the village stays in the village.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that is shared, anyone who comes, we create, a life of our own within that space. Um, our full presence, our full attention, and that looks like pure listening. So listening to understand rather than listening to respond.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that really speaks to, we come into this with presence by having an awareness that, we might feel something when we sense someone else's discomfort. And so if I'm showing up to Village Grief Circle, and I have that awareness, I am going to mindfully manage that so that I'm not projecting that onto someone else.
Mm-hmm.
I think that also speaks to a space of non-judgment, of compassion, um, and just full acceptance. Like we enter this space with acceptance of each other exactly as we are, and not really like a lot of times when we go to each other with our grief, and I think it's along the lines of trying to fix or avoid, we sometimes want to give advice, or
Mhm.
offer some sort of like platitude, like they're in a better place now, or everything happens for a reason. Um, and this is saying, like, okay, I'm holding space for you. I am simply witnessing you without words.
Mhm.
I think another agreement of this is that we're allowed to ask for what we need. And
Mhm.
in person, that would probably look different than what it will look like virtually. But, you know, in person, if I'm crying, I might ask for a hug or a hand to hold. And in this space, I might ask that you just like, visualize yourself looking at me through your heart,
Mhm.
some other way that we've decided has the shared meaning of a hug.
Mhm. Yeah. And all of those things that you just described, I think is going to be taking practice because they're not things that we have been raised to know how to do them. And so I would expect that this would be a place of a lot of grace and acceptance because um, and forgiveness because not everybody's going to know what to do or do the right thing or do what may come naturally to them, and so it's kind of a joint learning experience to practice this new way of showing up in the world.
Absolutely. I think that that is integral. For me as a facilitator, I want us to feel safe failing, you know, and really just re-envision there is no failure. We're learning here and we're building what we want to grow.
Mm-hmm.
So I also look at this as a co-creative endeavor. I am not, I don't have the market cornered on grief care. I have lots of resources and personal experience that I bring, as do you, as does, I'm imagining, everyone else with a pulse who's coming.
Mm-hmm.
I welcome everyone's wisdom and intuition, um, because we are all stakeholders in this.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So we talked about this village grief circle experience, and earlier we talked a little bit about the Waking Death conversation group. So clearly, they're two different ways to explore grief and loss, but kind of which experiences might be what kind of people might be able to benefit from the different experiences.
Well, I may be biased, but again, I think that everyone with the pulse would benefit from contemplating death, and everyone who's alive and will lose something would benefit from community around grief.
Mm.
Um, I would say that waking death is a little bit, it's very conversational. Um, it's informal. It's, there's, it's a serious subject, but there's at times there's laughter. It's in some ways a theoretical conversation. It's less personal. Whereas grief work, grief support is highly personal. And
Mm.
the person who's coming to that is someone who is feeling their loss.
Mhm. So maybe the waking death is maybe a little bit more in the headspace.
The thinkers and the feelers.
Mhm. Yeah. And the grief circles are a little bit more in the heart space,
Yes.
and the grief circles might be for people who are ready to experience a little bit more vulnerability
Mm,
and grief in the very personal setting, whereas the waking death is maybe a little bit less of a vulnerable experience, but looking at things in a little bit more of a higher level. People still do share their personal experiences, but maybe not as in depth and not in an as vulnerable way. Does that sound?
It does. And I have witnessed so much beautiful vulnerability and tenderness at Waking Death. And so um, I think that in this time when people are maybe more aware of their impermanence and more in touch with anxiety and fear around death,
Mhm.
definitely see how that can lend itself towards vulnerability, and that is welcome. Uh,
Mhm.
Curiosity about mortality is, I think, um, a wonderful space to explore that, uh,
Mhm.
rather than just simply trying to avoid panic when you go to the grocery store.
Mhm.
Um, but I would say, in general, the grief work is going to be more inherently vulnerable.
That makes sense. So, is there any other insights that make sense to share with people right now, or uh, things that have come up that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
Um, I feel like that is really covering it. Initially, both were slotted to be monthly events for the foreseeable future, living and dying in the time of Corona. We're going to offer those once a week. Well, I should say, Waking Death will be every 2 weeks, and the Village Grief Circle will also be every 2 weeks,
So they'll alternate.
meeting Wednesdays. So every Wednesday, you can find a space to either talk about death or talk about grief.
Mhm. Yeah, and so we'll actually be starting that up next week, next Wednesday, April 20th. And so if you go to the Soul Care Facebook page, you can find more information. Both of those experiences are free, being offered free. So we're very mindful that people may have limited resources during this time, and we want to be open about sharing these important conversations and experiences for people's spiritual health. Um,
We're also open about having this resource be available at a time when it's serving the majority of people who are interested in using it. And Wednesdays have just been what we've been doing so far. So if you're watching this, if you're interested in participating and you see that these are not offered at a time that works for you, please reach out to me or to Soul Care or to Kelly and let us know what your preference is, or just that it's not a good time for you. And we'll be keeping our ears out to make sure that we're serving as many people as possible well.
yeah, because we want to be here for you, for our local community. And even if there's people that you know that can benefit from this experience because it's virtual, it doesn't have to be in the local Champaign County community. It can be outside the state. It can be pretty much anybody who needs it can participate. Yeah. Okay. So stay tuned to the Soul Care social media pages and hopefully the website. for more information. And we hope that you'll get connected with either the Waking Death conversations or the Village Grief Circle or both. Um, and we hope that this will be something that can support you and serve you during this time. So thank you, Melanie.
Thank you, Kelly.
Bye.
Bye-bye.